it doesn't matter what the thing is labeled if the essence is good. We like to label things so that we feel safe engaging with it. If it says water on the outside, but the contents are purple, you know it's not water, right? If it says Christian on the outside, but they're running around burning people at the stake and genociding entire races of people, and then you have the people that are, of the indigenous tribes, and they're more Christ-like and peaceful and so full of love and compassion and awareness. Like, who am I to say, well, I like your contents, but you should relabel yourself for my anxiety? Like, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, love is the point. But it's not many paths that lead to God. It's still just one, self-sacrificial love. If you got that, I don't care what it's labeled. It's the path to God. If it doesn't have that, well, then it ain't got much. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. This is Dr. Tom, and this week I have an Ask Me Anything episode that I'm going to take on some more of your questions that you sent in, and I think I got 4 more pages left of things. I got my notes in front of me today. And I kind of like to, I learned early on that if somebody asks me a question, like, part of me wants to answer immediately and with a really impressive answer. Like, I want them to know how smart and insightful and deep and profound I can be. And I learned years back that they'd rather not be impressed with me, but they'd actually rather I address their question well. And when I get out of the way, that really helps. And so I started to take time to sit with certain questions and just kind of let them, almost like when you're making chili, you don't want to just cook everything and then serve it right away. It's just a lot better if it hangs out in the pot for a little while. So, I do that when people ask me questions. I like to just kind of sit with them for a while. And then when, I just kind of put them back in my brain somewhere, my subconscious is still thinking about them. But then all of a sudden, an insight will pop up out of nowhere. And I'll be like, oh, I have something for that question now. And I kind of did that with this one. I've had this stuff written for, I guess, a long time. But I've been doing other interviews with some other people that I've been learning a lot, actually. Anthony Smith and Dr. Randy Woodley last week. Good Lord, those two podcasts made my brain explode. And I love to talk with the people who are shaping my ideas and my views and how I see things. And I like to talk with them and let you see and hear these folks that are doing that. So that's why I kind of do both these solo episodes and then some interview episodes, because I like you to be able to not just engage with my thoughts on something, but to engage with the people who are shaping those thoughts into something. I've had a lot of mentors near and far. Anthony Smith, I've been following his thoughts for a couple of years. I never even spoke to the guy or interacted with him much on Facebook. And when I called him up to go through what we could do for a podcast, he was like, how do we know each other again? And I was like, well, we don't really. This is the first time we talked. I've just been following your thoughts. So I like to take those people that are shaping my brain and my thoughts and just kind of give you direct exposure to that. And then I also like to give you access to what I'm thinking about. So that's part of the fun of a podcast, is I can do whatever I want to do with this thing. And I try to do what's most helpful. So I got some questions I'm taking on. This is kind of part 2 of that theology one that I took on a couple of weeks back. and I got some more questions of a theological nature. I also have like questions of a social nature that I've got some stuff to still think through and process, and I haven't written much on that yet. But I do have a good amount of stuff ready to go for this one, so I thought, I'll record this one. I'm not sure when this one's going to air. I have another interview with Matt Tebby coming up this week, and he's a really interesting individual. I like his thoughts around American consumerism, capitalism, and he's written a book that we're going to be talking some of his ideas that are really challenging. But I'm going to throw this one in there somewhere, so we'll see where it lands. But first, before we get into that, I thought I'd tell you a story. Many of you know that my early faith years were, fundamentalist in nature. There was some kind of charismatic fundamentalism with a lot of end times controversy stuff with, characters that were predicting the end of the world over and over again, like Jack Van Impe and Hagee. I think it's Jack Hagee, Pat Robertson. Those kind of figures were a part of the landscape of my early faith years. And I've done a lot of work to kind of gain a broader perspective on things than that. But I don't know if you know this, but apparently we missed another end of the world opportunity this past weekend. There was somebody somewhere predicted the end of the world was going to be September 23rd of 2023. That was this last weekend. And it kind of went viral, probably for multiple reasons, because some people are just drawn to this kind of stuff naturally, and they love it, and they have that conspiratorial thinking, and they confuse their conspiracy theories with theology. We've talked about that before. But some people were drawn to it because they wanted to, poke fun at it and troll it, and I probably leaned on that camp myself. I'm like, oh, here we go again, another end of the world. But we are still here. So here we are. The end of the world didn't happen. And I was not surprised. There may have been a time where I was caught up in it. Y'all remember Y2K, stockpiling some black-eyed peas and SpaghettiOs in your basement with 50-gallon drums of water. We was pretty sure the end of the world was coming. The Antichrist was on his way, and Jesus would rapture us out, hopefully, before all that stuff happened. But all these things, they just never pan out. And I've been on a journey to broaden my perspectives theologically, spiritually, and all that. And a really big stretching for me happened right around 2010 to 12 when I was getting my master's degree. And during that time, we had a lot of retreats, and my master's degree was in spiritual formation, so a lot of inner journey stuff. And that's kind of becoming a lot more popular today with, doing the inner journey, and you're doing your own work and counseling and therapy and healing and trauma and all that stuff. And I was exploring that when I was getting my master's degree through spiritual formation program. And I was exposed to ideas that were a lot broader than mine, a lot older than mine. And that's the key. Like, a lot of this modern evangelical understanding of the Bible at its oldest is going to be about 200 to 300 years old. Back with the Puritans and all that. And I talked with Randy Woodley last week about how colonialism is what is like really enmeshed in that understanding of needing to save everybody and fill their heads with the right ideas. But there's older thoughts than the one that's dominating Western view. There's a lot older thoughts. And I was exposed to a Benedictine monk by the name of Father Bernie. And he was one of the retreat directors. And he was teaching us things like how to meditate, how to chant, and how to have a spirituality that was steeped in everyday things, regular life, your humanity that you have, which is, we have a faith that says that God became human, and then we want to make everything so dramatic and not human and, ultra special and all this stuff. And he was just really showing me how faith could really work in our everyday lives. And I had an interaction with him that really started to blow the doors off of my understanding of the faith for a while. And it ties into a question that Scott asked me. And so I thought we'd go there today, and we'd have Father Bernie help us out to have Scott's question. So Scott wrote, and he said this: "We just visited a place in Virginia where we had a memorial for a loved one, and this place was called Yogaville. It's a religious retreat center that welcomed all religions. Their philosophy was one truth, many paths. According to Christianity, the only way is through Jesus. According to another religion, the only way is through their belief system. How can we all be right? Does God give many paths that lead back to him?" Now, you remember Father Bernie. He taught me how to meditate. He taught me how to have a spirituality that was steeped in just regular, everyday life. I actually asked him the same question on that retreat. We were sitting around a lunch table in between sessions, and there was some other students at the table, a lot of different ages, a lot of different denominations, but the thing that we had in common is we're all from a Western evangelical kind of a tradition. And so I asked that question, and then everybody leaned in, because we're taught that nobody comes to the Father except by me, and this whole exclusivity interpretation of some of the sayings of Jesus. And he said something really simple and really profound. He didn't go into a big diatribe on it. He just said Jesus can meet someone with their own religious framework, and it's still Jesus that does the saving. And then my brain exploded a little bit when I heard that, and expanded a little bit on the topic. And the fact that my brain needed expanding shows how much Western colonial supremacy of Christianity has integrated with my theology. And I just talked to Randy Woodley about that on episode 23 last week. So Christian supremacy. That's the idea that the only people with the correct ideas about God are the people who pray the magic prayer, or the people who, take the magic bread and eat it every week. Or there's this group of thinkers that believe that you have to have the right ideas in your brain, and, I have those right ideas, so let me give them to you. And then we will pull, quotes from Romans or quotes from Jesus to say, but only people, there's no other name, I think that's Acts, there's no other name under heaven by which people can be saved, but by Jesus. Okay. And then Jesus says himself, nobody comes to the Father except through me. Okay. So we're taking these phrases and then translating them, interpreting them to say, my understanding of Jesus is the only way to get to Jesus. Or, my religious framework is the framework that Jesus must have been talking about in order to get there. And we don't look at how much our framework has changed since Jesus spoke those words 2,000 years ago. That's Western colonial supremacy sneaking into our Christian faith and then becoming something called Christian supremacy. And we use different verses that are going to justify that belief, but we interpret them through the lens of Christian supremacy instead of looking at the verses as they are. And we think that only my idea about God is the right idea about God. And this absolutely ignores the wonderfully peaceful indigenous tribes who are more Christ-like and in sync with the whole intention of God's for all of creation than the colonizers who came over and burned people alive under the suspicion that they were witches or that they had heretical ideas about God, or they were baptized again as adults, and so they had rocks tied around them and thrown into the water. The Catholic Church did that to the Anabaptists, who said, well, your infant baptism doesn't matter to us. We want to be baptized as adults. And so the Catholic Church drowned them with rocks. And then we have the Inquisitions and the holy wars of taking back the Holy Land from, people of the Muslim faith. And like Christopher Columbus actually said in his journals that the indigenous island people that he encountered were so peaceful and generous and amiable that it's going to be so easy to enslave them all. And so, is it that Christianity that's the right Christianity? Or is it, the people of indigenous tribes who worship the sun and they have it all wrong because we worship Jesus and we have it right? Well, the truth is that God is not an idea. God is love. And I don't think that everything flies as truth just because I want it to. Many modern evangelicals are actually making up their own truths about, the 2020 election and attempted coup on the White House. Though they're the ones that were warning us of the dangers of postmodernism's alleged subjective truth. Truth needs to be objective. And you got all these people coming in here and they're bringing your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth kind of stuff. And now we have those people warning us about it are the ones who are cannonballing into those waters head first. And then you have somebody on the opposite end of the spectrum, like Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a Buddhist monk in Vietnam, who was exiled from Vietnam because he was against the war. And so he was exiled to France. And he became good friends with Thomas Merton, and they learned from one another. In Thich Nhat Hanh, there's this really funny story where he's a very influential person. He's written many books, and I have some on my bookshelf, actually. I can see him from here. But this masseuse, like a massage therapist, just loved his works so much. And he went up to Thich Nhat Hanh and he said, I've learned so much from you. I want to bless you with what I can do. I want to give you, a massage and ease your muscles. And Thich Nhat Hanh said, sure, go for it. And so, he lays on the table and then the masseuse starts searching for the tight muscles, and he didn't have any because he's so incredibly at peace with himself and the world. He did not have a single muscle that this massage therapist could find of any kind of stress or anxiety or anything that he could relieve. And so he's like, I would love to give you a massage, but I can't. None of your muscles need it. And that's because Thich Nhat Hanh has done a lot of work on self-reflection and meditation and being mindful in the present moment and just being a person that's at peace. And somewhere along the way, we got caught up in the labels of everything. And I've said this before on this podcast. It doesn't matter what the thing is labeled if the essence is good. The labels are just what we do to something. We like to label things so that we feel safe engaging with it. But if the essence is good, if the essence is true, if the essence is love, then what does it matter what label is placed on it, right? If it says water on the outside, but the contents are purple, it's not water, right? If it says Christian on the outside, but they're running around burning people at the stake and genociding entire, species of people, races of people, what is it? And then you have the people that are, of the indigenous tribes, and they're more Christ-like and peaceful. And, Thich Nhat Hanh, this Buddhist, is so full of love and compassion and awareness. Like, who am I to say, well, I like your contents, but you should relabel yourself for my anxiety and my belief system? It just is totally unneeded. The contents, the essence is what's important. So if we're increasing our capacity of loving others and God and self and the creation that we live in, then we're fulfilling all the law and the prophets, as Jesus said. That's his own words. If we're increasing in our awareness of God's presence, then we're going to be able to see that love outside of the playing field that we're most familiar with. And if we're growing in those two things, I don't care what you're labeled as. If you're labeled properly but don't have those things, then you're just a clanging cymbal, as Paul put it in 1 Corinthians. If you don't have love, then you're just a big clanging cymbal. And we have enough clanging cymbals in our day, right? Like, love is the point. This is not like a flu add-on that we uber spiritual people like to talk about. It's actually the point of the entire faith. Like, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, love is the point. Many people who claim to have the right ideas are very unloving with those ideas, just to put it kindly. So Christ does the saving, how Christ sees fit, and I have no right to condemn another person for having the wrong idea or the wrong label. If that idea or that label is leading to an authentic expression of self-sacrificial love in this world, how can I criticize that? I mean, Paul said in Galatians, faith expressing itself in love is the point. But Christians are not the only ones who can be fundamentalist and cruel with a belief system. That's just the one I'm most familiar with. Anyone who weaponizes an idea against another person has crossed out of the realm of love and into the land of fundamentalism. And anyone who believes that they have a monopoly on the truth and the rest of the people live in a conspiracy, they're living outside of humility, which Thomas Merton considered the bedrock virtue which all other virtues are built. If you don't have humility, then you can't have love. If you don't have humility, then you can't have peace. You don't have humility. It's the bedrock. And when a faith believes itself to be the only true expression of faith in the entire world, in all of history, then it forfeits its humility and becomes militantly violent, even if their only weapons are ideas. So, Scott, to answer your question, Jesus can find anyone, because with God all things are possible. But it's not many paths that lead to God. It's still just one. Self-sacrificial love. If you got that, I don't care what it's labeled. It's the path to God. If it doesn't have that, well, then it ain't got much. So Lance wrote in, kind of singing harmony to this one. He said, how do we know which religion is right? And if Christianity is it, how do we know which version or interpretation is right? So, similar question, but with a little bit of a twist. So, the Bible says you'll know them by their fruit. And we looked at Thich Nhat Hanh in the last question and how he was offered that session of massage and there was no muscles in his body to actually be massaged out, right? That's a person who has good fruit. He's a loving person. If you were to encounter, I mean, he's passed away now, but if you were to encounter Thich Nhat Hanh, you would encounter grace. You would encounter mercy. You would encounter love. And you would encounter those things aimed at justice. He was fighting against the Vietnam War in his country, saying we shouldn't be doing war, and then he was exiled for it. And Thomas Merton became good friends with him, and they taught each other things about their faith. And Thomas Merton actually secretly confessed and not secretly, he wrote about it, but he confessed to Thich Nhat Hanh. He said that he would love to become a Buddhist. And Thich Nhat Hanh, he said, why don't you delve the depths of your own faith first? And then Thomas Merton said, okay, I think I will. And he ended up diving into the Christian tradition and found that the waters are plenty for him to swim in. And Thomas Merton was brilliant. So you have someone like that, Thich Nhat Hanh and Thomas Merton, who can sit around the table, be very good friends, and teach one another from their traditions on how they can be better loving humans that are aiming for justice in this world. And then there's Christians who abuse and manipulate, are full of hate, and they're bigoted monsters. And I just don't believe that we're judged on our ideas about God. You know, we're going to get up there, and then there's some litmus test of theological nature, and it says, write down what you think about the Trinity. And if you get something wrong, they're like, sorry, we have a different room for you, and it's filled with fire. I just don't see that anywhere in Scripture. Matthew 25 actually gives us this really interesting description of the final judgment. And it actually says that we're going to be judged by the loving actions we did or did not do in this world. So there's the sheep and the goats that are being separated. And to the sheep, he says, hey, you did a good job. You visited me in prison. You clothed me when I was naked. You know, when I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I can't remember all of the things, but there were physical needs that were met. And then the sheep, this is really interesting. They're utterly confused. They're like, wait a second. We don't remember doing any of this for you. And Jesus says, well, when you did it for, the least of these, the brothers and sisters of humanity, then you were actually doing it for me. Come on in. And then, he turns to the goats and he says, well, you weren't doing these loving actions of clothing the naked and feeding the hungry and visiting the imprisoned and basically alleviating human suffering. You weren't doing any of that. He said, wait a second. When did we not do that stuff? And he says, well, you didn't do it for humanity, so you didn't do it for me. And that picture of this final judgment moment says that the ones producing the loving actions in the world are the ones that are actually doing the things for God. They're the true followers of God, of Christ. And the ones that are increasing their capacity of awareness of God and love for others. When we do this for others, we're doing this for God. I just don't care what it's labeled. The essence is there. When you do those things, when your actions are aligned with making this place a better place to live for the humans in your vicinity, you've aligned yourself with the purpose of God. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right? We don't have to fill people's heads with ideas about God that they have to have correct in order to be on the right side of things. It's about loving action. And if you want to know my further thoughts on judgment and hell and universal reconciliation, there's a whole podcast episode about that one. You can dive in. So that's Lance. That's my answer to that question. Now I got a question from Rosey that I had to really take some time to think about. And I'll just read you the question. Rosey said, if God created humans in his image, male and female, what does that actually mean? Is God not genderless? Follow-up question to that. If God doesn't have a gender, what does it mean when Jesus refers to him as Father? And why does he choose the masculine? What does the original translation of those things mean? And I used to primarily refer to God in the masculine, just because that's default for most of history. But when I started my master's degree in 2009, it was actually something I was not allowed to do. I was not allowed to write masculine pronouns for God in my work. And this was not some progressive school. This was a Free Methodist school. Free Methodists are not very free. They're Like, they're not allowed to do a whole lot of things. I don't know why they're called Free Methodists. This is a very fundamentalist school. Some of the teachers were not that way. The teachers in my curriculum were not that way. But the school itself was, and it was a school policy. But I thought it was silly. I thought, what does it even matter? But I said, well, this is what's required, and I started to do it, and then I started to learn why. And so that's kind of like when I was first exposed to this gendering of God. So the overwhelming imagery of God in the Old and New Testament is going to be masculine. There's no way around that. Isaiah refers to God as Father, so did the Psalms. God has also got these like masculine archetypes that is like warrior and king and husband. Now, I really don't need to go into all those. I think we all know them. We all seem to prefer them, even if it bugs us. I still sometimes will refer to God with a he pronoun every now and then, and I catch myself because it's really awkward to refer, just to insert God, the name God, for a pronoun, because then you're repeating God so many times and it gets bulky. But I still do it. It's a practice that I do because I think it's important. So I don't need to go into all of that. But the overwhelming image of God in the Bible is going to be Father. So before we get into like what a biblical family is, the one that you have in your head is not biblical. Whatever biblical even means, right? The one that you have in your head of what a family is probably informed by 1950s stereotypes from America. You're going to be informed by like television shows that were around that. Now, in the culture of the Bible, it doesn't even translate to that 1950s stereotype. That's when nationalism really started to grab hold of Christianity as a way of furthering its conservative viewpoints politically. So you have, In God We Trust being minted on our money, and One Nation Under God being added to our Pledge of Allegiance. And it was in response to like a communist Cold War time. So then anything that wasn't tied to American capitalistic, consumeristic things was seen as kind of fearful and communistic. So that whole family archetype from the 1950s is one of those things that we enshrined. And then all of the biblical references to family, we then like superimpose those over top of the 1950s family structure. So Christians have seems like we have two infatuations when it comes to families: 1950 stereotypes, and then like Little House on the Prairie times. So just look at Christian romance fiction. What age is it going to be from? Most likely you're going to find somebody on the prairie somewhere churning their own butter. And then a dashing young pilgrim comes in and saves the day. I don't know. I don't read those books, but you look at the covers and that's what the age they're in. Now, in the culture of the Bible, the father is not just a man who had kids, right? That's what we think. You have become a father. You have, your first child is when you become a father. But when the Bible refers to the father, it's not just the guy who has some kids, but they're referring to a patriarch of a family system called an insula. So you could be the father of children without being the patriarch of a family because you're not old enough yet. And you can have like 12 kids and still not be a patriarch if your dad is still alive. So the father was this older grandfather figure who was the overseer of a large family unit that's called an insula. And he was the firstborn of his father, inherited a double portion of the family's land and home and business. And now a town was like Nazareth is going to be made up of like 4 to 6 of these family units. And they would trade with each other and have this local economy going. And the father individual was the one who cared for the family unit, which would most likely include a matriarch figure as well. And then the father's sons, and then the father's sons' wives, and any children that they had. And how this worked was the father would marry off his daughter to other families' sons to make like business alliances. And then when a son of the father would marry, the son would build a room on the family estate. And when he was done with the room, then he would go and get the bride and bring her back to the house. A lot of Jesus's language around, I go and prepare a place for you, is kind of around this, because Jesus is looking at God as the father patriarchal figure, and he is the son, and now he's going and getting the bride, which would then be the followers, and then bring them back to this place that he's been preparing. Like the whole imagery is around that betrothal imagery around, sons marrying wives, bringing them home to the family estate. And it's not like you have your house on the back 40 and then your brother has a house on the other 40. No, like it's all one building. And there's a mutual courtyard in the middle and a mutual kitchen. And so the family is growing and getting large. And then the patriarchal figure, the father, oversees this whole insular thing. And then the firstborn of the father is the one who's going to inherit all of that and then become the father, the patriarch. So God as father is not some 21st century dad, but more like this patriarchal king of the home kind of a thing. And if you don't like that imagery or it makes you uncomfortable, that's because it's 2,000 to 3,000 years old. So that's okay. So to say that God has ordained some sort of Donna Reed-like scenario as the family that shall ever, more shall be, that's just totally wrong. The family that we see today is not the family that was back in the day. The people who wrote the Bible used the imagery available to them, and one of them was patriarchal figure. They also use that of master and slave, and both of those images have been cemented in stone as if they're like the ordained way by modern fundamentalists, which we're taught. And we're taught a fundamentalist approach to the scriptures. And then after 100 years, we're like, okay, slavery was wrong. That must have not been the ordained way. It takes us a long time to change our minds about things. And I think when we look at how patriarchy operates in modern day society, we can see that it has been abusive. It has objectified women. It has done a lot of damage in society. So it's not the be all end all of what God is like. There are times in the Bible where God takes on feminine imagery as well, which is pretty radical because it was a patriarchal society to live in. So to make your God take on feminine imagery is really interesting, especially when you only have one God. If you had many gods, you can afford for some of them to be female, but you needed that strong male one to really. But here, this people of Israel are they're not monotheists because they believe that there are other gods out there, like the Philistines. Read the story of David getting the ark stolen, and all of their gods are bowing down to this ark. The statue just keeps falling over. And they're like, oh, your God's greater than our God. Take it back. So they were monolatrists. They believed in worshiping one God. So to make that one God have feminine imagery as well is actually going to be kind of radical in this day and age. In Isaiah 66, God refers to God's self as a mother comforting her child. And in Hosea 13, God is referred to as a mother bear robbed of her cubs and coming to violently tear people apart. Now in Deuteronomy 33, God says that God gave birth to the people of Israel, like a mom, and gave birth. In Isaiah 42, God takes the imagery of a woman crying out in pain during childbirth. And even Christ, who came as a man, even Christ compares himself to a mother hen, desiring to gather the people of Israel under his wings in Matthew 23. So the concept that God had characteristics that were traditionally known to be feminine is in the Bible. Nurturing, protecting, birthing, like those things are in there. So does God have a gender? The Orthodox answer is going to be both yes and no, which is not a cheater answer. It's just complicated. The Genesis account says that God makes male and female in God's image. But this has less to do with gender and more to do with roles. Like when a king went away from a province, but he wanted to remind the subjects of that place of his ongoing rule, he would commission an artist to make an image of himself to remind people who he was. Now, one of the Caesars of the early church day, Domitian, he did this actually. The Roman Empire was so vast that he couldn't be in all the places at once, so he commissioned these statues to be made and shipped overseas to the places where he wanted to remind them of his rule. Now, in Revelation, this is actually referred to as the beast that comes out of the sea because it came across on these boats. And then there was this Domitian statue. And there's a whole, like, if you look at that passage, it actually describes how Domitian was taken off the boat and brought through on this whole procession. Now, the funny thing about this statue is that Domitian is like this short, stout little guy. He kind of looked like Danny DeVito, but he didn't want his statue to look like that. So he was like this tall, muscular figure in his statue, but really he was kind of short and round. Okay, back to Genesis. Now, God doesn't make a statue of God's self and say, here's my image, make sure y'all remember me. He actually makes a commandment against doing that thing. Don't make any images. So God instead sets up humanity, both male and female, as the regent rulers of creation. And it's their job to tend creation in order to make it livable. So there's a thought that says that this imagery is both the role as regent royalty and gender, and that God has like a human-like form that both male and female genders come out of. And that kind of hurts my brain to think about. So I don't know. Furthermore, like as a Trinitarian Christian, there's Father, Son, and Spirit, right? So two of those are blatantly masculine, Father and Son. Spirit is kind of goes either way. And these are roles as well, not meant to be literal genders. Like the Father, the role of the Father is that of creator and sustainer. And it's not meant to be a male role. It's just that was traditionally masculine back in those days. So it took the name Father, but really it's the creator and sustainer. It's just traditionally masculine spin on things. Now, the Son also is not meant to be a gender. It's meant to be the heir of the family of God, because only sons could inherit family goods. Daughters didn't inherit anything from fathers. They were married off for like a pig or a cow in those days. So the Son is the inheritor of what the Father gives. But again, it's not a gender. It's the Son's role is that of redeemer, because we are, like the Bible literally says, we're the body of the Son. So we're caught up in the Son. He has redeemed us back to God, right? And we have both male and female gender within that redemption. And then the Spirit is the empowerer. And it's fun to know that the word Spirit is grammatically feminine in the Hebrew language. Like Spanish, you have amigo and you have amiga. And the word Spirit in the Greek is actually neither feminine nor masculine, but neuter, which is genderless. So that's just an interesting note. But quick note, this is not exhaustive and most likely contains heretical thoughts, because once you try to explain the Trinity, you're going to wander off into that realm fast. It's not meant to be explained. It's meant to be explored. So does God have a gender? It just gets really complicated when you think hard about it. Like the human form of God, Jesus, was a man, And he resurrected as a man and ascended to the Creator, God. And now he is the human. But is he still a man in resurrected form? Or is Jesus now the Christ who supersedes gender? I think you're going to find many different answers within the Christian tradition. But a bigger question is, if God is man, then how did he save women? Because St. Athanasius said, what has not been assumed has not been redeemed. So the mere fact that Jesus took on human flesh said that Jesus redeemed human flesh, but Jesus had a male gender to him. So this was Incarnation. This is Athanasius's way. See, my brain is hurting with this conversation. But it's Athanasius's way of saying that the Incarnation saved humanity by assuming human flesh in its entirety. And that the idea that for humanity to be redeemed, Christ had to assume human nature fully, but Christ didn't become a woman. So some theologians actually say that Christ entered the female womb of Mary first and was joined to the female there, redeeming women first. Interesting concept and pretty radical for the 4th century, if you ask me. So is God the Creator a man? No. Is the Christ a man? I don't know. Is the Spirit a man? No. So that's why I say yes and no, because it's just really messy. And especially with today, when there's a lot of talk around gender fluidity, gender transition, and full disclaimer, like, I'm purposely not addressing that modern understanding of fluidity and transition because I don't understand it. And I understand that there's a belief that says that gender is cultural construct and different from sex. And this is over my head. I don't understand that, but I'm listening to the voices of that community to help me try and understand it. So I would encourage y'all to do the same. If you're having a hard time around that construct of gender and sex and culture, don't just listen to the people who are telling you what you want to hear. Listen to the conversations that people who are gender fluid, who are in gender transition, listen to their experiences. Try and understand things from their perspective. That's where I'm at currently. I don't have all these opinions on all this stuff because I'm still in listening mode on that. So that's why I didn't address those things here in this does God have a gender kind of a thing. And that was just a really big, messy conversation to say, I don't know. Yes and no, and I don't know. But there's a lot of stuff there to unpack. All right, Wendi wrote an interesting question. She just said, what's the deal with karma in the Christian faith? Okay, so the cheater answer is nothing. Karma is a Buddhist concept and not a Christian one. But y'all know me, and I can't leave it there. I've actually dipped my toes in the waters of Buddhism enough to know and see correlations in biblical concepts. But we need to understand what karma is according to the Buddhist tradition, because it's often misunderstood in Western contexts because it's Eastern thought. West and East thinking are really, really different from one another, even if you're a Christian. Like a Western Christian is very different than an Eastern Christian. Look at the Orthodox Church versus like a non-denominational church plant in an evangelical church tradition. You're going to find something very different in there. Eastern and Western thought is totally different. Our brains are actually different. Like Westerners, we're influenced by Greek philosophy and logic and the Roman organizational empire structures. I mean, just look at our alphabet. Our alphabet is what we call phonetic. C plus A plus T equals cat. There's a logical progression of 3 phonetic letters that make a word. It's almost like math and like a phonetic equation. And we have 26, phonetic sounds in our alphabet. Well, there's more than that because each sound can make different. Each letter can make different phonetic sounds, but you kind of get the point here. Okay, so we have 26 letters in our alphabet, and you put them together like a math equation to get a word. Now look at the Chinese alphabet. It's composed of symbols, and the average Chinese-speaking Mandarin is going to need to know 2,000 to 3,000 characters in order to communicate well in their culture. That's going to make our brains very, very, very different. So it makes sense that there's going to be like this misunderstanding of karma in a Western culture as opposed to an Eastern culture. And I am a Western thinker. I grew up in the West. So I even have a hard time with this stuff, even though I have tried to study and understand it. Now, a Western understanding of karma is that it's retributive circumstances doled out by the universe on people who deserve them. Just think of the phrase like karma's a bitch, like, oh, you got what's coming to you. Karma swung back around and bit you in the butt, right? That's actually not what karma is. Now, in Sanskrit, karma means action. Despite popular belief, it isn't some cosmic scale keeping balance of merit and demerit and then doling out, consequences. It's not like that. It's a framework of describing how the movements of one's mind can eventually shift one's reality. And that was from a Substacker called Quarantine Writing Practice. Now, the Buddhist concept of karma is part of a philosophical underpinning of the tenets of Buddhism. And they have 4 of these things. They're called the 4 Noble Truths. In order to understand karma, you need to know how it works in these 4 Noble Truths. So the first noble truth in Buddhism is that life is suffering. Isn't that beautiful? Life is suffering. Okay, so it's not what you think. The term suffering there is the word is dukkha. And it's often translated into suffering, but the word is a lot more nuanced than like pain. It means a general unease or dissatisfaction with life. Now, cognitive scientist John Vervaeke says this about the word dukkha. Suffering means to undergo, to lose agency. So you can actually suffer joy, experience so much joy that you lose control of yourself. Pain is certainly one common way of losing agency. It's very disruptive, usually preceded by damage, which is probably why our current sense of the word aligns more to that example. So the Buddha isn't saying everything is painful. Most of the Buddha's metaphors aren't pain metaphors. They're entrapment metaphors, being fettered, losing your freedom, losing your agency. Now, the etymology of dukkha actually comes from the idea of like this axle to a wheel that's a little bit off center, and that causes this unbalanced rolling that eventually destroys itself because everything's out of alignment. So that's John Vervaeke's understanding of life is suffering. Life is, we don't have agency over our life, and that even when we're happy, we're suffering happiness. So the first truth is to realize that life is dukkha. Life means to undergo things that are out of our control. Now, the second truth is that dukkha, or suffering, is caused by desire or grasping. And John Vervaeke says that a better way of interpreting this is you can realize that dukkha can be observed and understood. And if you can understand it, you can do something about it. And that leads to the third truth. The cessation of suffering is attainable. So John says another way of thinking about this is to say that you can recover your agency. And the fourth part is, as a way forward, the Buddha offers the eightfold path: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, we're not going to go into the eightfold path today. We're going to show how karma plugs into the 4 pillars here, the 4 noble truths. See, if you're out of alignment because your desire and craving are driving your life, it creates a byproduct called karma. Karma is not the universe getting back at you for doing something dumb. Karma is the byproduct of a life lived out of alignment, a life lived that's not according to the Eightfold Path. And the Sanskrit word for karma, we said, means action. So a good way to think about this is like a baby crib's mobile. You grab one item on the mobile and it sends the whole thing rocking and moving. And Buddhism believes that by living the Eightfold Path, it brings your life to a calm and a stop. And then those karma-producing ways of living stop. And you cease experiencing the negative karmic outcomes. So you cease suffering. Now, if you don't understand all that, it's totally okay. I don't get it either. I grew up with a Western mindset, and it's hard for me to grasp Eastern thought. But think of it in a smaller form. Something maybe that you can bite onto. Expectation is premeditated disappointment. I've heard that said. It really stuck with me. Think about it. If you have all these expectations and you don't experience those expectations, then you experience disappointment. So living the Eightfold Path can actually teach you to not place so many expectations upon your life and just kind of live in the present moment, mindful of what is. That's just a tiny slice of how this karma thing can work. So if the word dukkha means loss of agency as the source of suffering, to learn to live in the present moment as it's presenting itself to you without the desire to change it or manipulate it into something else, that is what the cessation of suffering means. Now, if you've lived through abuse, loss of agency might be a traumatic trigger word for you. That's okay. The goal is not to give up your agency to somebody else, but to be empowered in the present moment by realizing that agency is an illusion. And to change your life, you don't have to grab hold of it violently and do something with it. You have to live the Eightfold Path and experience less karmic events coming out of your life. So when you align your interior, your exterior starts to align with it as well. Now, does this concept translate into the Christian experience? With some acrobatic work, yes, it does, because the concept of the Hebrew word shalom is the concept of harmonizing your inner and outer worlds so that you experience what the Hebrews called salvation. To break shalom is to disrupt how things ought to be in the world. The Bible's word for that is sin. And we've taken both of those words and made some really weird things out of them. The main story is Adam and Eve. It's a mythological story from Genesis that says this is how God has set up the world to work, archetypically. But then Christ comes and lives the life of love perfectly and overcomes death. And I talk a little bit about shalom with Dr. Randy in episode 23, so you can go listen to that if you want a broader understanding of shalom. But the Messiah, Jesus, was expected to do three things according to N.T. Wright. He was supposed to claim the throne, cleanse the temple, and rally the people against Rome in a big military rebellion to regain their agency. And all the Messiah figures did this up to that day and ended up crucified. Simon of Perea led a revolt against the Roman authorities, was captured and executed. Athronges, he led a rebellion against the Romans after Herod the Great's death. He and his fathers were eventually defeated. He was executed. Simon Bar Kokhba, Judas of Galilee, these were all people who claimed or were announced as the Messiah, and they all led military rebellions against Rome, and they all ended up dead and hung on a cross. So Judas of Galilee, he actually led a rebellion against the Roman census that you see talked about in the Christmas story in Luke. When Quirinius was governor, the Caesar ordered that a census be taken of the whole land. Now, Judas of Galilee, his followers were called the Zealots. And some of the disciples, you see Simon the Zealot and all that. they were zealots. It was thought that Judas Iscariot was a part of the radical zealots called the Ascari, who would just like shank people in the crowds if they were Roman sympathizers and like assassinate people that way, slip off. They're like Hebrew ninjas. Now Christ enters Jerusalem on the donkey as the people are shouting and chanting, Hosanna, blessed is the Son of David. This act that he did was actually claiming the throne of his ancestor David, and the people got all worked up. And then he cleansed the temple by throwing the money changers out. So it's clear, okay, God's on his side. The last thing that we got to do is mount up this military rebellion against Rome. What better time than the Passover when all of the people are here? But instead, he allows himself to be arrested, tried, crucified without a fight. So the main idea, the power of love can overcome the love of power. And by grasping violently for their agency, they actually sowed seeds of violence back into the world to be reaped again. But Jesus defeats power with love and regains agency after losing it entirely. So a Buddhist might actually say that he stopped karma in its tracks. But unfortunately, the Jews of his day were bent on military rebellion, and in 66 AD, they started a war with Rome again. And as Jesus said in a lot of his judgment language, if you do that, then Rome's going to come down here and squash the city. And they did in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. Okay, Nick wrote in, he said, did the Creator create us individually or broad stroke? What level of detail went into his design? And Lance wrote in a complimentary question, how does the Bible coexist with science? All right, let's dive in. I already mentioned Adam and Eve as a mythical story. The story of creation is a myth that was intended not to tell us how things came to be or when things came to be, but the theological nature of the God behind creation. Now, lots of modern Christians have a problem with that statement, but the Catholic Church had a problem with Galileo when he said that the sun is actually at the center of the solar system and not the earth. And they actually only recently forgave him. I think it was in 1996 they finally forgave Galileo and said, well, our heart was in the right place. We forgive you, Galileo. And Galileo's up there like, about time. So the Bible tells us that God knit us together in our mother's womb, right? But if you go into a biology exam and they say, how are humans made? You write that down, you're going to fail. And most Christians are going to be fine with saying, well, here's the science behind how, humans are formed in the womb with DNA and cellular structures and the creation of the nervous system and how it sprouts organs, and then you grow an endocrine system and all. I'm not a biologist. I don't know how that works, but I know that if you just say on your biology exam, God knits us together in the mother's womb, you're going to fail. And I don't know why we don't apply that logic into creation. And we say, what's the creation of the universe? And we say, well, 6,000 years ago, God said, let there be, and there was. You're going to fail your science exam. Now, I don't know, we have a problem with that one, but not with the other one. We have to understand that, Genesis is poetic theology, not science. Science better explores how things came to be. And I'm out of my element on that one too, because I'm not a scientist. I'm a little bit of an astronomy nerd, so I have a working knowledge that roughly 13 to 26 billion years ago, there was some kind of explosion of dense and hot material that expanded into the known universe. But at first, it just scattered a bunch of hydrogen and helium into the galaxy. And then that hydrogen and helium started to clump together, and then they accumulated into masses, and like a snowball rolling down the hill, they got larger and larger until it became large enough to perform something called fusion. And they exploded into these stars. And the heat of a star fused hydrogen and helium into other elements. And when those stars burned out, they exploded in a supernova, and they sent those new elements out into the universe. And that was these things that the raw materials for planets and moons and asteroids and comets that would then be formed. And then, yes, even biological life came from these factories, elemental factories called stars exploding. And in about 4 million years, I think it's 4 million, or maybe it's billion, I can't remember, our star is going to explode and do the same thing. So one of these planets somehow sparked life in a single cell. Some think it was the result of our moon causing tides, which created tide pools, bathing those tide pools in UV light. And that UV light then created RNA, which is a building block of life on our planet. And that has actually been recreated in the lab. We know that that works. Then these single-celled organisms merged, forming multi-celled organisms, which then evolved into early creatures and dinosaurs and birds and mammals and primates and cave-dwelling folk, and then eventually humans. That was just a light speed traversing of our history as Darwin, got us thinking towards. So then Lance went on to ask, does the Bible mention dinosaurs? And the answer is no, it does not mention dinosaurs. It mentions mythical beasts and large monsters. But they're not witnessing a brontosaurus before their eyes. If you go down to the Ark Museum down in Kentucky, the Creation Museum, you go on the Ark that was built, you're going to see like the Dimetrons and little baby brontosauruses on the Ark, which is just weird to me. So the Bible actually doesn't mention dinosaurs because they died out millions of years prior to that point. They're not witnessing brontosauruses before their eyes. It could be some large animal that's now extinct, maybe, that we don't know about. Could possibly be describing that, mythical beasts. And the Bible is just not that kind of a book. So I'm not a full-blown materialist that doesn't believe in a spiritual part of creation. Science has yet to explain the mystery of consciousness, like what consciousness, they don't even have a definition for consciousness right now. When did consciousness come into being? Was it a moment when all the right biological pieces came together and their collective produced something called consciousness? Or is it a single piece that was deposited in the brain? Is it an immaterial part of us that's not connected to the body? We just don't know. Where did the material for the Big Bang even come from? What sparked the explosion? Why is there anything in existence at all? So while scientists can give us really helpful facts on the process and the answers to like the how and what questions, I think spirituality gives us the meaning and purpose and beauty and answers the why questions for us. And I try to let the two be what they are and have fun in whatever pool I'm swimming in at the time. And yes, this can get me into some trouble with some Christians, but I stopped caring about that a long time ago. So to get back to Nick's question, did the Creator create us individually or broad stroke? I don't know. I know that DNA has a lot to say about what you're going to look like. And your DNA is determined by your parents' DNA, who is determined by their parents' DNA and their parents' DNA, and so on and so forth. So is God actively, like, in the process of knitting people together in wombs with DNA, or is it just broad stroke, I'm going to create DNA and then let that DNA do what it does? I don't really know about that. That's an interesting question. That's kind of a deistic understanding of, the winding up of creation and like a clock and letting it run and just walking away from it. I'm not sure what level of detail went into his design. Like, there is this thing called your personality, and that is very unique. You're the only person like you. I mean, you probably met people that have similar things like you, but nobody's been exactly like you ever. So maybe that's where that individuality knit together is talking more about the essence of the person's being absolutely unique. And maybe our physical, biological thing is broad stroke, determined by our DNA and our parents' DNA and our upbringing and our ethnicity and our, neurological development and our environments around us. But it's that unique piece of that spark that makes you into you that God spends the time on. So that's kind of just my thoughts around it. And I hope that doesn't sound like the answer, because it's not an answer. It's just the thought. And Lance, that's how the Bible coexists with science. There are two very different things altogether. So I think that's all I got time for. I've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes. I'm going to shut up and go home and eat lunch now. But thank you so much for joining us today for this episode, a little Ask Me Anything, where I kind of rant and rave about some things that are fun to rant and rave about. If you like my ranting and raving, then you can stay tuned in. If you haven't heard any of the other Ask Me Anythings or some other episodes that we've done, they're fun and interesting things. You should go listen to them. They're fun. If you like this, you'll like them. So we'll see you next week. We got more interviews, more questions, more thoughts, more processings, and I think you're gonna like it. So thank you for giving me an hour of your time. I hope I have given you something worth it in exchange. We'll see you next week. Peace out.